and I wove it. So come, and you're going to be able to see either side. So this is great. And I'm just going to say to you that generally speaking, I try not to do linear. I like us to be in a circle, but it's a bit much to try to move all the furniture. So just so you know, you would normally be seated in a circle. So thank you so much for emptying the tables, taking care of your dishes, and hopefully you're going to take home whatever's left out there. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Creator God, maker of all things, we give you thanks for this day you've gifted us with. We give you thanks for opportunities. And we give you thanks for open hearts and minds as we seek to learn your will and your way. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Ken's going to play the first 4 sections of this video. I want you to know that it is from the Canadian Episcopal Church. And so once in a while in the video, it'll refer to Canada, but everything that's in there applies to us. I do mean everything. And we're going to do 4 sections, and then we're going to have some questions and a little bit of dialogue. And then we have a couple more sections and a little more dialogue, and we'll go from there. Okay? Ken?
The empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal divided up the world. And they were very active in terms of exploring the world and taking our lands illegally that were already occupied by indigenous nations worldwide. So they went to the Pope of the Catholic Church to validate the illegal taking of the lands. And what did the Pope do in the 14th century? He issued a papal bull. The papal bull provided instructions that indigenous peoples are not human or Christian. Because indigenous people are not human, they don't have sovereignty in government.
I remember reading it and thinking, that doesn't make sense. How can you simply take over somebody's territory by saying you no longer exist or you never existed because we didn't know about you?
It wasn't until I was older and starting to educate myself on our history and what had happened and why our communities are in these states was when I heard the Doctrine of Discovery for the first time. So I just remember reading it and thinking, like, this can't be real. This isn't something that makes sense. This is something that's like inhumane and just not something that was fair to the people that were the protectors of this land.
Another word for this is terra nullius, empty land. And the land is made empty not by clearing the people out, but it's made empty through law.
Chief Justice John Marshall basically said, in simple terms, we are sovereign because of the Doctrine of Discovery. We have the right to govern this land because we discovered it. And he wasn't talking about we in the American sense, he was talking about we in the white man sense. And that therefore, those nations that were here, those Indian nations that were here, are now semi-sovereign nations. So they're no longer sovereign. They are dependent upon our sovereignty, our willingness to let them retain some elements of sovereignty.
It's relevant because not only is it basically the root of the whole structure of property law in Canada and the United States and Australia, for instance, but it is thoroughly enmeshed in the structures of our law so deeply that it's often difficult to even spot it.
This fiction, this hidden foundation still lives with us because we don't assume, by and large, that Indigenous peoples today are primitive or have lower social skills on this kind of hierarchy of civilizations. But nevertheless, the law continues to assume that sovereignty of the Crown is paramount, that Crown title is underlying all of our land, when in fact that comes from nowhere. It comes from just an assertion.
The underlying question is how, in the Canadian context, for instance, where does the Crown get its right to hold underlying title for all lands, which is the way that our law is structured? Where does the Crown get its jurisdiction over all matters? And there's this sense that this came out of the ether. It was always thus. Starting at the time of the first colonial incursions into the Americas, there had to be justification. Why did the colonial powers have the right to take over these lands and assert their sovereignty or their jurisdiction? What did they do about the fact that there were people here already who were living in, using these lands, exercising their own laws, having their own political structures? There had to be some sort of justification to allow that colonial authority to be asserted.
Sadness surrounds me, traveling through Aboriginal homeland, see things that others can't. Longhouses, smoke bellowing from its center, surrounded by wooden palisades. Brown woman tending the three sisters, the corn, the beans, the squash. Men wandering through the bush, hunting for deer and other sustenance. Children running through the woods, playing games, laughing. Mohawk River flows, Creator's artery, bringing fish for harvest, a waterway for travel. can smell the sweetgrass, the strawberries, the first fruits of summer.
We occupied the whole Turtle Island, US and Canada, now North America. And our nations and our people were granted inherent rights by the Creator.
It wasn't an empty land, and there were lots of government sort of structures. The Mi'kmaq had different provinces. They used to come together on, regular meetings. The 5 nations and then the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. These were people who were mostly farmers.
In Ontario, it's estimated that there was about 90 to 110,000 people living here when the Europeans came in. When the Jesuits, for instance, came in 1615 along with Samuel de Champlain, encountered the Wendat people, the Huron. There they lived as 40,000 people between what's now Barrie, Orillia, and Collingwood. And they were in villages of 2,000 people, and there were 200 miles of roads that were connecting these villages.
And there were trade routes everywhere. They found parrot feathers in the Arctic. The trade routes were the incredible way of getting around and ensuring that people were able to survive. So if you've got all of this territory in corn from the early Haudenosaunee peoples, and you've got northern hunters with moose meat and deer meat, and there's going to be trade. This area was settled because of the wealth of the waters as well, not just the land.
We were highly organized and structured in our governing systems, and we had the kinship clan systems of the various nations on Turtle Island, and really major functions, duties, and responsibilities of each of the clans in the kinship clan system that formed the basis of how we structured our governing systems.
The essence of the clan system is that you respect the gifts that different people bring. And so some people are really good hunters, and some people are really good cooks, and some people are really good with money, and some people are good intellectuals. And the essence of the clan system is you respect what each of them bring, and collectively we figure it out.
What I often refer to is who made the laws, who made the rules. The female side, the grandma, the moms made the rules in the family, the home, and the community. And as men, we had to enforce them.
The whole concept of buying and selling land was a foreign concept to us. We didn't believe in it. We didn't believe that the land could be bought and could be sold, and that we were letting people use the land, and it was not a permanent transfer.
It is about thriving cultures with political structures, with their own legal norms, with their own systems of exercising jurisdiction, with their own property laws. And many of those societies continue to today. So a really wonderful example of that in a Canadian context right now is the archaeological discoveries that have been confirmed in the within the last 2 years on the BC coast. So in the area of the Heiltsuk First Nation. One is the excavation of a 15,000-year-old village site that the Heiltsuk community today knew about. So within their living memory, they knew that this was a place that their community had used 15,000 years ago and had continued to use for the past 15,000 years.
But then I see blood. My ancestors covered in red lifelessness. Settlers' blood too. Who was right? Who was wrong? Both wanted good life, good land. Now I see farmlands. Wonder if they grow the Three Sisters. See hard pavement that was once soft trail, good to walk with deerskin moccasins. Old stone buildings and homes carved out of once pristine land now replace longhouses and a good, creator-given life that was before.
over the years, 50 years now that I've been walking that way, so I've met many First Peoples, but I've been able to develop relationships with them as people. I began to learn the facts, the truth, the history. The fact that we signed treaties, that the Indian people, as we talked about Indians, had been here for thousands of years, and we were the newcomers among them, and we were the people who came and lived within their territory, their homeland, and they accepted us as neighbors. They were willing to take us in.
There's an innate respect in our people for everyone and everything, because everyone is a creation of the Creator, is created by God. Therefore, that's an automatic respect. And so we just went along with them and helped them get along and helped them survive.
There's a complicated set of factors that broke this relationship that was quite strong at one point. Settlers needed Indigenous peoples for knowing about the land, how to survive, food. Often it was just men coming along, and so there was partnerships formed, and the children were mixed between European and Indigenous parents, and that went on for 250 years in North America and was quite strong and developed distinctive cultures in many of those places. I think what started to erode that was the development of a mercantile system that could alienate or separate people from one another through trade that then had war attached to it.
Canada has not got the reputation the United States has, where there was a lot of killing and shooting and burying of bodies. In Canada it was a little more subtle. These people that were here were in the way. And so how do we remove these people in a way that isn't bloodletting, but confines them someplace else? And so that was the remove people from their lands, put them in a space where we can contain them, control their access to resources. With MacDonald, John A. MacDonald, our first Prime Minister, it was let's just starve them to death. If they can't eat and they can't survive, they can't make babies, they can't continue.
Of course, if you want to disorient any population, the first thing you must do is somehow break their contact with the land, because the land on which they live is the source of their identity, their medicines, their food, their ability to self-sustain.
And then that didn't work, so let's just take their children away, and we'll teach their children how to do things our way.
Let's help them by taking their kids from them and raising them in Western ways. And so you take them in, you strip them of their clothes, you shave their hair, you douse them with lye, you put them in identical clothing, and when they try to speak their languages, you put pins through their tongues, you punish them corporally, you tell them that their parents aren't and their communities aren't worthy of emulation.
Can you imagine a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old taken from their parents, institutionalized, and then everything good about being a First Nations person is no good? Their beautiful long hair was cut. Their beautiful languages weren't allowed. Their access to their families and their ceremonies were disallowed. And everything they've known, the pride in who they were as a First Nation, it's no good. Your family's no good, your community's good, your nation's, First Nation's no good. In fact, you're no good. Then on top of that, you put on that physical abuse, then sexual abuse and mental abuse. You are not healthy coming out of that institution.
The doctrine of discovery is something that we could say clearly was behind the residential schools, because it was about Christian and European superiority and the notion of remaking Indigenous people in that image. For their benefit was the perspective, for their benefit either in this world or the next. And we know the impacts of the residential schools didn't stop with the closing of the residential schools, that those impacts spilled over into generations and are causing intergenerational trauma even to this day.
Well, what do you think? A lot. You are so right. Heavy stuff. Heavy stuff. And you know, next week we're going to do a workshop just on boarding schools, and then the third week we'll do the missing and murdered Indigenous people ones. And so we're just focusing on the doctrine tonight, and we'll be more into the other ones in the next 2 weeks. And so I guess I would like to ask, do you have a question? We'll have questions for a few minutes, and then we have a couple other pieces that I want us to be able to see. Comments?
The role of religion is really...
Oh, I forgot. Excuse me. We're not going to do this Indian style. We're going to do it so that Don can hear.
Okay.
It's not working. Not working. Well, it's continuing up till today, though.
Absolutely.
The role of religion is shocking. I mean, the Pope's initial decree, the schools were set up by supposedly spiritual people.
Many religious organizations. And
so really out of touch with God.
Yes.
You know, I mean,
I'm not gonna dispute that, Scott. And the last piece I want us to see tonight is on spiritual arrogance. So that, you know, is after we have a little bit of discussion. So, but you're right. I mean, they were looking, the explorers were looking for someone to give them the authority to claim this. And who better than the Pope, right? Yeah. Because it wasn't just Italians, you know, the Pope covered a large area. And so that then allowed this papal bull or edict to be worldwide. It wasn't just here. It was everywhere. We are the ones that have to deal with what happened here. But it went wherever those explorers went, for sure. Other comments? How could they do that? Well, I think the word greed was in there, and one of the words that I've heard before is that people with a mentality of white superiority. Definitely. Gwen?
Yes. Having taught in a school where 1/3 of the students were Native American, it was very interesting trying to present anything about exploration and Native peoples, and yet it's doable, but it's very difficult.
That's true, but now the state of Washington has curriculum that's called Time Immemorial, which comes more from a Native perspective and teaches history that includes Native peoples. And it's wonderful. I believe it's mandated in our districts now. And I don't know that all districts follow the mandate, but it's really helpful to our Native students to be in class where you are lifted up instead of put down. So that's been a huge, huge problem in public education.
I worked in Eskimo schools in Alaska for 8 years.
Wow, whereabouts?
I was in Dillingham.
Oh, Dillingham, okay.
And Shishmaref.
Shishmaref.
And St. Mary's.
Yes,
I was there the whole time. And the Eskimos are really very smart people.
They are.
You're not fooled, you don't fool them.
Right. I mean,
they're very neat.
And they're like any people, they're not, society has put a label on them without knowing who they are. And when you have a one-to-one relationship with someone, you learn about them and you learn about what they know and what they look for.
They tell wonderful white men jokes.
I'm sure they do. I will tell you, Jim and I had the honor of being up in Nome for the 5 Lutheran churches up there come from the villages, and we were there.
Kishmaref is in the part from Nome.
Yes, and we had, it was my turn to cook, and they had brought in it's not a reindeer, what is it, honey?
Reindeer.
The reindeer. And the pastor had brought it on the back of his snowmobile, and so I went out to the kitchen to get the meat ready. He had failed to skin it. Anyway, we got it done, and the meal went, and then it was dessert time, and we had Eskimo ice cream for dessert. Do you know what Eskimo ice cream is?
Yeah.
Well, if they run out of whale blubber, it's lard. Crisco, with berries on it. Again, culture, you know. What do you intake in order to survive the cold up there? You know, it has all to do with where they live, what's available, and what the other sustenance could be. And so we wouldn't probably pick that for dessert, and some of us didn't, and we were rude. But fortunately, the lady across the table from us loved it, so it didn't go to waste. Other comments?
I was going to make one.
Yes,
here.
Susan.
2 things that complicate when the, quote, conquerors came into the land. First of all, they carried disease.
Oh, absolutely.
Hispaniola. How do you eradicate that many people so fast? And like COVID hit us initially and took out, you think back to New York, you know, we would have said, this isn't possible. But when they had refrigerated trucks and they had people stacked up to be buried, it's possible. And that's the kind of thing that hits and hit at that time. The other thing was, while there were all these tribes, common languages and so forth, if they could speak between each other, it was a lengthy conversation. Things were not a common language. One thing that I've been watching the Canadian channel because I really like their television, and they have just had a Reconciliation Day that was a national holiday. And they ran a lot of information. And one interesting statistic is if your ancestors have been here for 4 generations, somewhere along the line, you have Indian blood.
You have what?
You have native Indian blood.
Yeah.
This is what they're finding from the DNA studies. If you've been here for 4 generations, chances are like 90% that somewhere in your line you have native blood. So this is our story too, in one sense of the word, even though we didn't know about it, is that has happened. Certainly the relationships are not the kind that are documented necessarily in marriage and informal things that you can pick out. But in that DNA, it shows the true story.
And you saw that piece in there where it said that there were intermarriages. And you know at that time they didn't record all of them, right? And so many of those would not have been recorded. So
I turned it off.
thank you. So there, and at one time, you know, if you were marking on the census, if you were anything other than Caucasian, if you had any other blood in there, you could not be Caucasian. And what do we have now? You know, we have many mixed bloodlines in there. But there was this superiority, well, if you've got any other mixed blood in there, you're not Caucasian. And that mentality went forward. Any other comments? We can take 1, maybe 2. Any other questions? How are you doing it? Is this making sense to you? Is it new to you? A little trouble understanding?
Yeah, the other people talking, some, you know,
Yes.
have a voice that carries, but some aren't.
But what's good for this is that they're going to post it on our Facebook page, and you can watch it again at home. Okay? So that you'll be able to go back and say, oh, what was that? Okay, got it. So I also have handouts. But I'm not going to give them to you till you're done, because if you're like me, you kind of thumb through them and aren't paying attention. So, you know, I've done this too long. I know how this goes. So, anything else you want to say before we go on to the next part? Yes.
I'm going to turn this back on. It was pretty hot. Just hold it to your chin. It's going to be really loud.
My chin? Okay. Hi, I'm Vanjie. I'm the United Methodist pastor, and I just have like an underlying anger when I watch some of this. If you ever get the chance to watch Reservation Dogs on Hulu, it's one of the first. I don't know about the first, but it's an original show done by natives about natives in Oklahoma. I want to say somewhere in Northeast, but it shows some of the realities of Native youth today and how some of this plays out. It's a current thing, and I'm so glad to hear about Washington State history, that they're make it a point to have it from a Native point of view, whereas we see the opposite end of the country with Florida, it's or other places in between, and it's they're wanting to continue to try and portray Columbus in a good light, and frankly, I'm a Christian. I'm not going to say those words right now, but yeah. So like, I just feel the anger as I go deeper and having personal relationships with natives, and it's very different when I get to know people from different tribes. Like the experience in Oklahoma is there are some stark differences, similarities, but differences than the tribes that I grew up with up here on the coast. So, but it's easy for us, I think, I'll speak for myself. I sometimes feel like it's easy for us to look at history and think it's a back then thing, but this stuff is still interplaying out right now, and frankly, in our name, as especially those of us who are white and American. But, so, I don't have any resolutions for you. But thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. And one other thing that you may have noticed, that they call North America Turtle Island, and that is primarily on the East Coast, because many of our West Coast nations have different creation stories, and it isn't about a turtle. So, anyway, without further ado, we'll go to the next place. Thanks, Ken.
I think a simple declaration of repudiation would be sufficient, but there are many who would question whether or not that would be far enough or go far enough. And within government, I think they wouldn't quite appreciate what the significance of that is, and because they don't know what the implications are, they resist the temptation to do it, or they resist the effort to do it. There are many within government who tread carefully when it comes to changing precedent. And so for that reason alone, just the fear of what it's going to do or what it's going to cause to them and how it's going to challenge Crown sovereignty, or undermine Crown sovereignty for that matter, I think it's a real question. It's a real open question.
We've come to expect that the land that we live on is ours, and that we should expect a kind of certainty in that. And I think that talking about things like repudiating the doctrine of discovery, it kind of unsettles that certainty that we've come to realize. But what I think is crucial for us is to understand that there really is another truth. And that truth is that we live on Indigenous lands, that we work on Indigenous lands. And that what we have to be about in the future is a recognition of that truth, and then finding a way to move forward together in that truth.
Once you pull out the linchpin and open that door, then there are going to be all these implications that are going to follow.
In the calls to action, what we suggested, recognizing that that was going to be an area of resistance, What we suggested was, let's develop together a doctrine of reconciliation through a proclamation on reconciliation and a covenant on reconciliation, because regardless of what one thinks about repudiation and the implications of it, we can go further and redefine our new relationship through those documents as well.
When I think about the Doctrine of Discovery, the image that comes to mind, and it's not an image that I am at all happy about, but here it is: spiritual arrogance of the worst kind.
All Christian churches who relied upon the Doctrine of Discovery principle, I think, have to make it very clear that they're no longer relying upon that, or that they recognize the invalidity of that.
Christianity got entangled with this process of colonization. It was kind of fuel to the fire. And that's a devastating thing to come to grips with.
I think that our churches are one of the biggest institutional racism organizations in Canada. I mean, and if you look at the structure, where are the Indigenous people in that structure?
Well, I think if racism is grounded on an understanding that somehow we're going to be saved from ourselves as a people, then I think racism is rife.
I am very proud to be a Catholic Christian and also a Mohawk woman. We as church people need to be strong enough and not to say, oh no, it didn't happen, or, well, I'm sorry. Just listen, and you don't have to say anything.
I first heard my first truth telling about experiences in residential schools in 2010, and that was a game changer. That the whole ground shifted under me. Because you can intellectualize this stuff to a certain degree, but then you hear stories from survivors, and it just, your head and your heart and your spirit connect differently, understand differently, learn differently. And it was sort of in that context that the Doctrine of Discovery, you can see the schools as a mechanism of this underlying concept. And so to see that written, to see that as an ideological concept that has shaped so much of not just church practice, but the history of European colonization in North America and in other places around the world, it's shocking.
It is very difficult to point and say, well, here it is. That's why the Doctrine of Discovery, I think, is a helpful way of describing it. It describes a systemic evil, a way in which a particularly dangerous and noxious idea becomes a part of the way people look at the world. It becomes a part of a worldview.
So as much as the churches are repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery, we have a larger challenge, which is a political challenge, which is to have it removed from our constitutions. And then the second part of that is, I think the theologies are still really strong within our thinking. And we haven't taken the time as church in our process of reconciliation to do that deep self-critique that is going to be necessary to change our worldview.
One of the great weaknesses of the TRC, in my mind, in Canada, is that as denominations, we're still separated. And every denomination has apologized for its mission history, I think. There have been many apologies, but we've never agreed that we would act collaboratively as people of faith.
How do we reflect on our baptismal vow to respect the dignity of every human being and to strive for justice and peace among all people? Here is an opportunity for us to talk about the history of our own church and our struggle to be faithful as a church to that kind of commitment associated with our baptism.
A Christian person as an individual has a twofold responsibility. Number one, they have to realize that they have been deeply influenced by these ideas, and they have to apply spiritual discipline and insight into resisting and countering these ideas in their own minds and hearts. And this is true for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people both. This insight, I think, helps people to begin to move into advocacy and to start promoting ideas and policies in their communities and their organizations that will counter the impact of these ideas.
You might as well expect all the rivers to run backwards as that any man who was born free should be contented to be penned up and denied liberty to go where he pleases. If you tie a horse to a stake, do you expect him to grow fat? If you pen an Indian up on a small spot of earth and compel him to stay there, he will not be contented, nor will he grow and prosper. I have asked some of the great white chiefs where they got their authority to say to the Indian that he shall stay in one place, where the white man sees that he can go wherever he pleases, and they cannot tell me. Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself. And I will obey every law and submit to the penalty.
That last speech was Chief Joseph speaking. Those are his words.
I saw real examples of that when I was in the Eskimo village.
I'm sure you did. If you've not had the opportunity to be up in Alaska to one of the villages, it's just so different. It's wonderful if you ever have the chance. I hope that you do that. Comments?
I was raised on a reservation in Montana. I think I told you that. And, you know, the harm that the reservation system has done is just unfathomable. Is there any way to undo that? I mean,
Okay, in Alaska, they have the 13 corporations.
In Alaska, they do have the 13 corporations, but here, I think here in the state of Washington, I think we have 39 tribes, if I'm not mistaken. But a book I would recommend to you is The Bitter Waters of Medicine Creek, which is about Isaac Stevens and how the reservations, where the people are here in the area that we live. It's an excellent book and really gives you an insight into how people ended up where they are. Another book that I truly like is by Steve Charleston, and this is Meditations, A Ladder to the Light. This is just wonderful. He was at one time the bishop up at the Alaska, he's Episcopal priest, he's the bishop up in Alaska, Fort Alaska. And I don't know if you noticed Dr. Martin Brokenlake. He spoke, and also Steve Charleston, and I had an opportunity to meet these people at the Native American Theological Association Summer Institute in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And that organization is now defunct, but we used to meet in the summertime, and it was wonderful. How many of you remember AIM? Any of you? That wanted to take back things that were theirs. So, and I had the opportunity, one of my other pastor friends had gathered up a van full of food and clothing, and we went into the hills past 2 armed guards to the camp in order to bring them sustenance and clothing. And sure enough, out there was the drying racks with the venison hanging on them drying, and the salmon, and it was just like stepping back in time. It was just in the Black Hills in South Dakota.
Oh, okay.
So that seems like a long time ago, but a wonderful experience. And so I have any other questions or comments?
Lots to think about.
Oh my gosh, there's so much to think about.
Well, my questions seem naive about, is there a way to undo that? But is that what like Ladder to the Light is about?
No, those are just daily meditations that he writes. How would you possibly undo it? When
You can't undo the harm.
no, you can't undo the harm, and because they are treaties, and those are nation-to-nation treaties that need to stay in place. What would happen to the Native people if we undid that? They would have no land. They would have no governance.
I wasn't suggesting getting rid of the reservation.
Oh, what are you suggesting?
I'm just thinking we need reparation, really. You know.
Well, the thing is, even on the reservations, they don't own all the reservations.
They don't. They were given allotments, and they could sell some of their allotments, but many tribes are busy buying back land. And my daughter works for the Muckleshoot tribe up there out of Auburn, between Auburn and Enumclaw, and they have bought back the timberlands from the timber companies. They own thousands of acres up there because, you're going to say, well, what about the casinos? Okay, the casinos paid for buying back those lands. And I'll get right to you in a minute. The other thing, like in my tribe, they bought land right along I-5, and yes, there's casinos there, but there's also a Cabela's store. They lease land to these businesses, and so there's income from the lease and from sales tax. And so there's some ways that this money, in the state of Washington, there is a compact between the state of Washington and the tribes of how this money can be used. And so part of that compact is the welfare of the tribal members. And yeah, and so there are ways that we're stepping out of the poverty, but not everybody, not all of the tribes are in a place where you're going to have a casino. I mean, there's some places in South Dakota, I cannot believe that they're still alive. It's terrible. They're just awful. They put them in the most awful places they could find. And what are they going to do? What are they going to do, In my mind, I, of course, have a little solution. I would think they could build one of those call centers there, and then they could speak English to you when you call for some help with some other product, instead of somebody who has clearly not an English accent, calls themselves George or Susie, it's like, not. So there are some things that, tribes are doing all over the country, different things. And learning back the language is one of them. My mother was at boarding school for 2 years. She did not know her language. I do not know my language, but my grandchildren went to language camp. And so, it's like learning it back.
The language, you're part of the Salish language group.
Yes, yeah. And so it's learning back some of these things, which is so very, very important. And I would just kind of touch a little bit on the ELCA. They repudiated the doctrine of discovery. You may or may not know that. Do you know that? And they, let's see, does it have the date on it? I used to know the date. 2016. And so they haven't done a whole lot since then. But but they now have a group working towards what we should do, right? And you know, as Lutherans, we talk everything to death before we do anything, right? So they're working on some things, and I have included for you a study guide on what things that, as members of congregation, can be done. And so this has the repudiation in it, definition of the doctrine of discovery on the back, and then I have one other thing for you. I'm sorry, Claudia, I lost. No, go ahead.
Well, you were talking about how tribes are doing things to gain back some of their lands and some freedoms, and I was just going to mention that there's a woman in Oakville who was on the school board for a long time, Helen Sanders. Do you know Helen? This popped into my mind because you talked about the tribes managing their forest land, and I knew her through forestry. She went to bat with the BIA to obtain the right to manage her forest on her allotment. And they gave her a really hard time. This would have been in the 1960s.
Oh, yes.
And she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court, where she won the right for Native peoples to manage their own land. And she lives 20 miles from here.
Isn't that
15
wonderful?
miles from here.
You know, you have to learn. When you learn the system, then you can do better. If you don't know the system and you don't know your way around in it, then it takes a lot longer. I also have, I've borrowed heavily from the Episcopal Church because they are a little bit ahead of us, which is wonderful. And so most of you know that there's the 4 directions, right? Native people always talk about the 4 directions, and so I have the beads on here from the 4 directions. And here's a little card that talks about things Native peoples you can generally talk about. And then on the back side, I have included the New Zealand Lord's Prayer that some of you know that I particularly like. And so those are things that I think are important that we think about. When we remember that when I think of that man who spent over a year up in space, can you imagine? We must be like a little half grain of sand, right? In the grand scheme of things. And it's so important to remember that we are of God's creation, that there are many ways to interpret the Lord's Prayer. And I think that one of the things that's so important is that we remember that life is short, but we can do something. Each and every one of us can do something, whether it's praying or whether it's being an activist or whether it's something as simple as writing a letter to the congressman person and help move forward legislation on the boarding school situation, because the Senate has passed it and Congress is kind of like mucked up right now, but that too will pass, right? So any last comments?
We had 2 people leave the church because I used that New Zealand Lord's Prayer.
Well, I'm glad they left. How can I say otherwise? If people aren't open enough to say, this is the only way I can pray, as the way I was taught when I was in confirmation or Sunday school, then they are closed to learning, to sharing, to being open to God's love for everyone. Right? Isn't that how that goes?
I have recently, and I have no idea why, but on my news feed for Facebook, comes up all these Native American dancing things, and they have these powwows or something. And
Of course, yeah.
I don't know why.
Social gatherings.
Several of them.
There's
If you
social
watch
gatherings.
if you watch one, then it thinks you want to see a whole bunch more.
Yeah, but I've been interested that it's interesting. They're dancing, and I'm glad they're getting that culture back.
Mhm.
So.
Absolutely. Oh my
That
gosh.
is, if some of you are receiving notices of the powwows and pictures from them, that is our former member Michael Whittinger's, who is married to an Indian. And they go to all of these and they post a lot. So if you are wondering at the source, it's Michael. That's getting
Wonderful.
posted.
Okay.
He also just tells us where he's delivering people for the Catholics.
Community service. Wonderful.
Services.
I'm okay with it. Yeah.
I think it's wonderful. I want you to hear these words of the Lord from 1 Corinthians. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot would say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear would say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is God who arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many members, yet one body. I want you to think of that in terms of people that we love and care about. Now, if any of you are going to leave the church after we pray this, be sure and let Pastor know why. I don't know. Does everybody have one? Okay. Please join me. Eternal Spirit, earth maker, pain bearer, life giver, source of all that is and that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God in whom is heaven, the hallowing of your name echo through the universe. The way of your justice be followed by the peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. In the hurts we absorb from one another, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trial too great to endure, spare us. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen. And I just want to thank each and every one of you for taking time today to be here and to listen and hopefully to learn. And if you have questions, you know you can contact me anytime. I'm more than happy to do that.
We'll be back again next week.
And yes, you're invited to come next week, same time, 6 o'clock, light refreshments. And at 6:30, we'll do boarding school. So thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.